How to wire a WeatherTrack Flow 3 photodiode using a direct installation technique or using a designated wire path from the Flow 3 to the controller. The WeatherTrack Flow 3 gets its name because the device has three features in one: a flow sensor, a master valve, and a water meter. The Flow 3 is available with either a normally open or normally closed master valve, as well as an option of the type of register you want to use, either a photodiode or a reed switch. Today's training will focus on the installation of a photodiode Flow 3 when the sensor is directly wired to the controller instead of on a two-wire path. Let's begin with a quick examination of the Flow 3 hardware. When you pull the Flow 3 out of the box, the first thing you'll see is the register. You flip the cap up and you'll see the register that will allow an on-site irrigation professional to see water usage accumulating during normal irrigation. Other things you're going to want to pay attention to are, first, the wire coming from the top of the meter head. These are your flow sensor wires, and if you have three wires in this multi-strand, you have a photodiode flow sensor. If you only have two, then you're looking at a reed switch. Then the black box on the side of the Flow 3 is the master valve solenoid on the side of the sensor. You'll see that it has the two valve wires coming from the solenoid. And then other things to pay attention to are the three-way selector switch, as well as the solenoid bypass selector switch right here at the base of the solenoid. Also packaged in with the Flow 3 photodiode will be this power supply box. Inside the little white box, you'll find the Flow 3 power supply. And this power supply is a little black box with a yellow, a black, a white, and an orange wire coming off the top of it. This is an essential piece of the installation as it regulates the power going to the photocell. If this power supply isn't correctly wired up, it can irreparably damage the meter head. And if the warranty review reveals that the meter was wired up without the power supply, the damage is not covered under warranty. So getting this power supply correctly wired is an essential component in the installation of a photodiode flow sensor. And the last couple of things you'll find in the box are a supply of these 3M 316IR wire nuts designed specifically to make waterproof connections for very small gauge wires. And then, arguably the most important thing you have in the box is this set of instructions, which is a wiring diagram detailing exactly how the Flow 3 photodiode is connected to the power supply and then back to the controller. And once we've unpacked all the components and securely mounted the flow sensor onto your main line, we're ready to start the project of wiring the photodiode flow sensor. Hopefully in your valve box you'll have the following items ready to go: the safely installed flow sensor, the photodiode power supply, as well as the shielded wire to supply the signal for your flow sensor, the hot and the common wire for your master valve, as well as one additional wire to supply the power for the photodiode. Adding this one extra wire is something unique about the photodiode flow sensor that's going to require heads up during the installation process to make sure we've installed all of the wires we need for a proper photodiode installation. Once you've got all the necessary components in the valve box and you're ready to start wiring, get out that wiring diagram and read it very carefully. In my opinion, this is all very straightforward. The trickiest part is that there are two connections on the wiring diagram that will require three wires in one connection. We'll start with those. Begin by finding the black wire in the picture of the power supply. You'll notice that it connects both to the bare copper coming from the flow sensor and to the black wire on your flow sensor pair, or the FL negative, coming from the controller. And once we've found it on the wiring diagram, we go into our valve box and find those three same components. So we start with our shielded wire coming from our controller, find the black shielded wire, find the bare copper from the flow sensor, and find the black wire coming from the power supply. It's these three wires that we want to connect together. For this purpose, we'll use the 3M 316IR wire connector that has three little ports where we stick those three wires securely into each one of the ports, and then we take our channel locks and crunch that down until the top is flush with the wire connector, and that'll hold all of those wires securely in place. After you finish connecting the black wires, let's do the other connection that requires putting three wires together. That's the white wire coming from the power supply. So locate the white wire on the power supply and you'll notice that it connects to the valve common coming from the controller, as well as either one of the black wires on the master valve solenoid. So I go back to my valve box, I find the white wire on my power supply, and I connect that to the white wire that I've got the common coming from the controller, and one of the wires for the master valve solenoid. And in this case, we're going to use a DBRY because that 14 gauge wire is too large for those little wire nuts. So we use the big ones, we crank down on a DBRY, and then we put it in the jelly and make sure it gets all the way to the bottom of the jelly. And the key to a good DBRY connection is to make sure that that wire nut is pushed all the way down into the top of the gel cap, so the gel covers the bottom of the wire nut and traps out any water or other contamination into the wire nut, and then make sure that the gel cap is completely closed tight around the wires. And once we've got the black and white connections knocked out, the rest are very straightforward. It's simply following the wire diagram to hook the wires coming in to the correct wires in the valve box. Specifically, we'll take this yellow wire from the power supply and connect it to the yellow wire from the flow sensor. In the valve box, it looks like this. We go to our power supply, grab the yellow wire, and connect it right up to the yellow wire on the flow sensor using the 316 IR wire connector. Next, we'll finish off our flow sensor wire by finding the translucent wire and connecting it to the red wire, or the FL positive, in our shielded flow sensor wire coming from the controller. In the valve box, we're looking for the last one of the wires from that flow sensor, the translucent one, and then the red or the FL positive wire coming from your flow sensor. And we'll use the last of the 316 IR wire nuts on this connection. Next, we'll find our MV1 or our master valve control wire and hook that to the other wire coming off of our master valve solenoid. That looks like this. We find the master valve hot wire and the other solenoid wire, and we hook them together with a DBRY connector, always using the gel cap. And then the last thing we have to wire up in the valve box is the wire that carries the 24 volts from the controller to the power supply in the valve box. Please make sure this wire is disconnected in the controller before attempting to connect it up. This important step will not only save you from getting shocked, but will also prevent non-warrantyable damage to the flow sensor components. Once you have it, you'll connect it to the orange wire coming from the photodiode power supply. So the last connection we have to make is to find our power wire coming from the controller and connect it here to the orange wire on our power supply, using a DBRY connection to keep that wire safe and secure from water damage. To complete the wiring of the photodiode flow sensor, we go back to the controller and connect the field wires into the controller. The first thing I always do when making wire changes is make sure I've disconnected the cord from the transformer to kill all power to the board. Then we'll locate the two wires for the master valve. The white goes into the VC or valve common port. The master valve control wire or hot wire goes into the MV1 port right next to the valve common. Then we'll locate our shielded wire that controls our flow sensor. From this we have a black and a red. The black goes into the VC or valve common that's labeled in black, and then the red goes into the red FL1 port. Black to black, red to red. The last wire we need to connect is the 24 volt power cord, and that plugs into the rain sensor. So to plug that in, I find my 24 volt power wire and I pull the rain sensor adapter out, and I will plug the 24 volt wire into the first terminal on the rain sensor port. The 24 volt power goes into this port right here. We lock that down. We plug that back into the board, and we're ready to power up the controller again by plugging in the wire from the transformer. Once you've successfully wired the flow sensor into the controller, go back to the valve box and look at your power supply. Look in the upper left-hand corner of your power supply box. When illuminated green, this tells us that the power is flowing from the controller and the signal from the flow sensor to the controller should be live. So the next thing we want to do is prepare the sensor itself. There are a few things we need to check to make sure that the flow sensor will respond when the controller sends it a command. Alright, so on a photodiode flow sensor, while we're looking in its valve, we want to make sure that the photodiode is covered, or the valve cover is closed, because that photo selector switch is using the light, so any light pollution will affect the reading of the flow sensor. So whenever you want to use the flow sensor, make sure the cover is closed. Over here we have the three-way selector switch. There's 3 different positions on the dial, and you can either have it on open, closed, or auto. And auto is the position that you want if it's running from the controller. And then down here we have the solenoid selector switch, and it can either face the solenoid or face the three-way selector switch. We always want the solenoid to face the three-way selector switch. This is the activated position, so make sure that this little guy is facing the three-way selector switch.
Once you've used the wiring diagram to correctly wire up the Flow 3 photodiode power supply and powered it up from the controller and confirmed the power using the LED indicator light, then you're ready to begin programming and testing the installation through the WeatherTrack controller. And remember, there are a few keys to success when wiring a photodiode flow sensor. First, remember to run enough wires from your controller to your Flow 3 device. The most common misstep is to forget to run a wire for the 24-volt power supply. Then use the wiring diagram that comes with the Flow 3. It's not too difficult, but it's nice to have a reminder in hand of how everything gets wired together. And remember that there are 2 connections that get 3 wires apiece, and beyond that, make sure your valve switches are in place, or your photodiode lid is closed, the 3-way selector switch is in auto, and the solenoid bypass switch is facing the 3-way selector switch. If you follow these few keys to success, you should have no trouble wiring a photodiode Flow 3.